Luis Garavito, the monster behind Colombia's darkest crimes. In the vast and haunting halls of true crime's most infamous names, Luis Alfredo Garavito, La Bestia, the Beast, carves a place entirely his own. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito preyed upon Colombia's most vulnerable, leaving a chilling trail of devastation. At least 193 young boys were confirmed victims of his unfathomable crimes, each a tender life extinguished by unspeakable brutality. This story isn't merely an account of a monster's atrocities, it's a reflection on systemic failure, societal neglect, and the haunting fragility of justice. With a grim tone, we will explore the life of Luis Garavito, his horrifying crimes, the pursuit of his capture, and the bitter questions his case left behind. Let us slip into the shadows and confront one of humanity's darkest chapters. In the turbulent streets of Colombia during the 1990s, where poverty and violence ran rampant, children were often left to their own devices. Many were homeless, working odd jobs to barely eke out a living for their families. It was these boys, often overlooked and forgotten by society, upon whom Garavito cast his predatory gaze. Garavito's victims were young boys aged 6 to 16, typically from impoverished neighborhoods. He preyed on their vulnerability, offering false promises of money, employment, or food. Once isolated from the safety of the public, Garavito unleashed violence and terror upon their defenseless forms, leaving behind broken bodies and grieving families. The scale of his brutality was only matched by his cunning. He moved constantly between towns and regions, a shadow slipping past the rudimentary law enforcement agencies of the time. For years he continued unabated, his numbers rising horrifyingly, until the chilling puzzle began to reveal itself. Who was Luis Garavito before the world came to know him as La Bestia? His early life offers somber insights into the making of a predator. Born in 1957 in a poverty-stricken region of Colombia, Garavito's childhood was marred by violence and dysfunction. His father was abusive, inflicting beatings and rage on both him and his siblings. The lack of affection and safety at home left deep scars on the boy. Psychologists suggest that Garavito suffered from severe trauma, resulting partly from physical and emotional abuse. There are even unconfirmed reports of him being sexually assaulted during his adolescence. While these circumstances may explain some of the darkness in Garavito's psyche, they fail to absolve him of his despicable actions. As an adult, Garavito lived a transient lifestyle, never settling into stable employment or relationships. His exterior was deceptive. Outwardly polite, he often gained the trust of those around him. Beneath the surface, however, lay the seeds of a predator waiting to sprout. His ability to mask his horrifying urges revealed a chilling and calculated mind capable of unparalleled evil. What sets Luis Garavito apart from many other killers is the level of calculation and foresight he employed in his crimes. He preyed exclusively on boys who seemed utterly alone, those others were unlikely to search for or miss. He selected his victims with precision, identifying characteristics that would reduce the likelihood of attention. Garavito's modus operandi was thorough. Disguising himself as a priest, monk, or street vendor, he used these personas to gain trust and lower his victims' defenses. Once he earned their confidence, he would lure them away to secluded fields, forests, or abandoned structures. Here, without witnesses or interference, he unleashed the full extent of his cruelty. The brutality he inflicted defies words. Victims were bound, beaten, tortured, sexually assaulted, and ultimately killed. His crimes extended beyond murder into sadistic and necrophilic acts that underscored an inhuman lack of empathy. By 1997, the faint threads of Garavito's horrifying spree began to come together. Investigators across Colombia started noticing troubling patterns, missing boys with eerily similar victim profiles. The remains of these children were being discovered in various regions, often showing similar patterns of wounds and restraint. At first, local police attributed the deaths to Colombia's endemic violence. However, as the death toll rose, it became impossible to ignore the signs of a serial predator at work. Luis Garavito confessed to killing at least 193 young boys, though some estimates place his total body count closer to 300. His victims were found across 11 of Colombia's 32 departments. Such numbers not only make him one of history's most prolific serial killers, but also underline the sheer tragedy of lives lost without intervention for so long. How could such horror go unnoticed for 7 years? The answer lies in the systemic failings of a nation overwhelmed with other struggles. To understand how Garavito eluded capture for years, we must first examine the backdrop of Colombia during the 1990s. This was a nation grappling with civil wars, drug cartels, and widespread poverty. Disconnected police forces meant that patterns of Garavito's killings across distant areas went unnoticed for years. In many cases, initial investigations were abandoned when no immediate leads surfaced. Local authorities simply lacked the tools or training to pursue a killer as deceptive and mobile as Garavito. Tragically, the impoverished backgrounds of many victims meant they were often overlooked by society at large. Their absence was a wound left to fester without resolution. The tide finally turned in October 1999, when Garavito made a fatal mistake. After luring another young boy, he was spotted by a witness who reported his suspicious behavior. Garavito was arrested on suspicion of attempted sexual assault. DNA evidence collected from crime scenes and confessions linked him directly to many of the murders. Investigators were horrified as Garavito began confessing, detailing his crimes with chilling precision. He cooperated with authorities, providing information about the locations of victims' remains. His confessions were accompanied by almost no visible remorse, showcasing his detachment from the immense suffering he caused. Garavito's capture brought some measure of relief to grieving families, but the ensuing trial would spark widespread outrage. Despite his astonishing list of crimes, Colombia's legal system exposed troubling limitations in its handling of serial killers. At the time of Garavito's sentencing, the maximum penalty allowed was 40 years in prison. Due to his cooperation in aiding authorities to locate victims and bodies, his sentence was further reduced to 22 years. The news shocked the nation. Families of victims and the public at large were outraged at the prospect of Garavito potentially walking free in his lifetime. Although reforms were later introduced, Garavito's case stood as a tragic example of systemic flaws that failed to equitably punish such unparalleled wickedness. Luis Garavito's crimes have sparked ongoing discussions about psychology and criminal pathology. Experts have scrutinized his behavior for insights into his motivations. Diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and other psychological conditions, Garavito displayed a disturbing blend of sadism and narcissism. His inability to empathize with his victims showcased a profound disconnect from basic human emotion. At the same time, Garavito's meticulous approach to evading capture illustrates the disturbing logic behind his acts. He claimed to have been driven by compulsions so powerful that he had no control over them. Yet his planning spoke of deliberate, calculated choices. It's a contradiction that continues to baffle experts and audiences alike. Was Garavito a product of trauma, or was he a soul born to harm? While this question may never find a definitive answer, his actions leave no room for ambiguity regarding their monstrosity. Garavito's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about one man's evil, but also about the systems and societies that allowed it to thrive. The neglect of Colombia's poor, the lack of protections for vulnerable children, and the disjointed nature of law enforcement created an environment in which Garavito's crimes could persist. Many of his victims remain unidentified, nameless shadows lost to tragedy. Their suffering is a stark reminder of how societal failures leave the most vulnerable at risk. The outrage sparked by his case led to increased public awareness about child protection services and strengthened laws to address crimes of similar nature. In telling the story of Luis Garavito, it is crucial that we recognize the real heart of this tragedy, his victims. Each child was a unique individual, with dreams and futures stolen by a man devoid of conscience. Across Colombia, their families have carried forward their memories, refusing to let their stories fade into obscurity. Monuments, local campaigns, and advocacy efforts in the wake of the case have sought to honor these children. Their loss, though unbearably devastating, has served as a rallying cry for stronger protections and greater vigilance against harm to society's most vulnerable. The story of Luis Garavito carries profound lessons about humanity, justice, and vigilance. It forces us to look not only at the horror of heinous crimes, but also at the vulnerabilities within our systems that allow such nightmares to take root. Garavito was undoubtedly a monster, but his existence reveals a collective responsibility to safeguard the lives of the innocent and prevent such horrors from ever reoccurring. As we reflect on one of the darkest chapters in crime history, let us remember the lives lost, the haunting absence they leave, and the enduring call to action their memory inspires.